Sunday of the month. And as per our tradition, we invite our two premier guests, Mr. Mike Muller, head of Vitol Asia, and Christoph Ruhl, senior research scholar of the Center of Energy Global Policy at Columbia University, to join us for a little look at the month that's just passed, but more importantly, what's ahead for the energy markets. And of course, today is a pretty significant day. OPEC are meeting again and in person, and have decided to include certain participants to come and observe the meeting. But we won't get into too much of that today. I'm more interested in seeing, we can guess at what they're going to do, but let's look at the reasons why they may do what they might decide on later today. So let me start with you, Christoph, please. And if we can look a little bit at, in the context of the signals that OPEC's been getting in order to be able to make its decision today, whichever way, before we speculate on what they're actually going to do. In the US, let's talk about the US economy. Last week, I had people saying on the ground, despite the figures, things are pretty dismal there. And yet we had it again, strong job figures. Positive sentiment continues. The forecasters have got it all wrong, haven't they, in terms of demand from there?
Yeah, most forecasts have been wrong, both on China and the US and on oil markets, because they treated oil markets just like an appendix to these economies, neglecting, that if you have a period of relatively high prices as we had, that this eats into demand independently of the economic performance. So for the same GDP, you need less oil. And B, a big reason for the fear of price spikes and the high prices was the very thin safety margins, low inventories, low spare capacity. With every cut, of course, these safety margins become bigger and safer, and the supply side incentive for high prices less pronounced. But I think as for OPEC and their meeting now, that's pretty clear cut. They have some serious, in my opinion, it seems to be they have some serious homework to do. In the short term, for now, if you, like me, believe that prices are a reflection of supply and demand and not some convoluted story about speculation, then, and that speculators basically jump on the train, we all try to figure out where it's going, but not driving it, then it seems to me they would have to lower prices. And what happened since the cut in April indicate that there's more supply than demand, and the consequences are obvious, right? But then in the medium term, they have some adjustments to do, because there are some countries, as we all know, who cannot produce up to quotas, and other countries like the UAE who justifiably argue that their production capacity has increased significantly. So they would have to adjust their benchmarks in the medium term. And I think they will, not this meeting, but in the medium term. And then in the very long term, I think with this geopolitical situation and these problems with Russia and so, the question arises, how long is the plus in OPEC sensible, and when will OPEC become an enlarged group, or when will their ways be defined differently in part? That's something also which is probably very difficult to manufacture, but which should be on the agenda if I would be in the shoes of OPEC, which luckily I'm not. But for the immediate outcome of that meeting, I don't want to speculate around. But I think these are the three things. Short-term excess supply, clearly visible in price pressures. Medium-term benchmark adjustment necessary to get the house in order. And long-term, what happens to the plus?
Okay, exactly. And I mean, Mike, on that point, so short-term excess supply, the fundamentals are looking pretty healthy in terms of supply. All the more reason why OPEC may feel it needs to do this extra 1 million that now is out there in the press, but who knows what they'll do today. But are they a bit stuck, Mike, OPEC? They've obviously want to keep supporting prices. They may end up doing something today because of that. But then the plus part, the Russia part, clearly as the days go by and weeks go by, Russia's getting away with more of not cutting when it's pledged because of its situation. How much longer do you think can the leadership of OPEC kind of go along with that formula?
Tricky questions there. I think the first thing that needs to be said is OPEC Plus have actually done a very successful job ever since COVID of managing supply demand, which is their stated objective, to secure the balance of supply and reasonable price stability. We have a price of Brent crude oil that's been cycling between low 70s and high 70s. Yes, some people say that a certain OPEC member states would like it higher than that, but we're not far off the number that some people suggest, $80 being some sort of target. As far as the Russian side is concerned, obviously interesting that Alexander Novak is flying into OPEC to join these proceedings today. A month ago, I think Christoph and I both observed that Russia hadn't done any noticeable cutting in output, but the data is awfully difficult to get hold of, and with some sort of time lag. I think the consensus amongst external observers now is that that there is a slightly diminished volume coming from Russia. I've seen figures quoted by third parties. We don't have in-house data on this, but by third parties of 300,000 barrels a day, lower in April versus March. So there is some contribution to the OPEC plus cuts there, after all, it would seem.
Okay, and I mean, what about this, just to stay with you, Mike, in terms of, we looked at the US sort of demand picture, China, you know, OPEC's forecasts for the second half have been still, demand is going to get stronger. We're going to have a, you know, more sort of an uptick there. And that would mean that they probably wouldn't do any further cuts today. But what's the China picture looking at now that we're in June? Any different from a month ago, let's say, for the second half of the year?
Yes, this is our favorite topic. Christoph, bearish, me more bullish on China. I think there are many things to say about China, so let me rattle through a few of them. Mobility data in China is good, even strong, I would say. However, in the diesel segment, and in particular for industrial use and in freight, the indicators have been coming through a little more disappointing. China is still accounting for a good chunk of the shortfall in jet fuel demand if you compare it to pre-COVID levels. We're running at something around 300,000 barrels a day below 2019 levels, all of which is international travel. And that's, of course, just within China. You can assume the same amount of barrels a day of demand missing for those same planes that need to fuel up outside of China when they head back to China. The gasoline demand is pretty okay. It's up on 2019 by perhaps a couple of percentage points. And there are certain sectors that have seen big investment that account for a large increase in petroleum increase, notably the petrochemical sector. And the main feedstock there, of course, being naphtha, which is up a good 20% on sort of early 2020 levels pre-COVID. And all that put together sees Chinese crude runs at or above 15 million barrels a day, which is all-time high level. So China is seeing a lot of people commenting on how they're participating in the energy transition much more quickly than anybody else, how they've got more electric vehicles on the road. Of course, the sheer numbers are indeed the case. But the bottom line is this: diesel exports from China, which were meant to saturate the market, and from the point last year in Q4, where there was a directive from central government that exports should be raised, that didn't last. And we've been running at diesel exports that approach 2 million tons a month. They're now tracking at about a quarter of that, at 500,000 tons a month. There are a number of reasons. Number one, no incentive to export in terms of weaker export economics, export margins. I don't think it's extra domestic consumption, but I think China is being economic about making less. Why produce more and run the refineries harder to supply markets after importing the crude and then exporting the diesel? On the gasoline side of things, exports are steady. So China continues to export about 1 million tons a month. They're actually importing more fuel, and they're importing more naphtha, as I said before. So all in all, in terms of import-export balance, China in the medium term looks relatively healthy. That said, if you now look at the economic side of things, the PMIs, the manufacturing indices, and certain sectors, notably the construction sector, still don't inspire confidence and are leading to messages from central government along the lines of stimulus.
Okay, thanks, Christoph. And the PMIs and certainly manufacturing in the US isn't looking too strong either when you look at the indicators from diesel, etc. But Christoph, I wanted just to get your views before we move on about the debt ceiling deal that was done last week, done and dusted, as expected, perhaps. Has that given any impact whatsoever to confidence in what's happening in the economy and how that might ripple through to consumer demand, energy demand, gasoline demand? I mean, what has the nervousness gone, if you like, from the markets there?
To some extent, yes. I mean, we all have witnessed this. You know, it's one of these extraordinary situations where everybody thinks such a deal needs to be done, and everybody knows there is this very tiny little marginal possibility of the monster in the corner leaving its cage and coming out and creating big havoc if the deal is not done. So in that sense, it's good. Politically, it's a win for the Biden administration, I think widely perceived as such. Politically, also, this will make it harder for the Republicans in the upcoming internal debate about who should be the presidential candidate to take on the Democrats, because it increased the splits within the Republican Party, visible for everyone, between the speaker who wanted the deal and this extreme right wing who didn't want a deal and wanted to raise havoc. For the economy, if I would have to take a bet, I would always, not always, but now, take a bet more likely on the US than on China. I think on China, it's pretty obvious we're running into big difficulties with the the official growth target down to 5%, the actual growth rate more to 2%. With so much hype, bounce back from COVID, just a myth, because they never had these monetary transfers, which would allow the population after the lockdown to spend and to bounce back as they did in the US. And with also their fuel storage full. And when you look at the net export numbers, the picture does not look very good. In the US, and worldwide, the big problem is going to be interest rates, because the effects of higher interest rates on leveraged households, on mortgage owners, on car owners, on all these people who might be on the verge of not being able to pay them, and on economies like that, emerging market economies, that will take some time to play itself out. We had these very rapid increases, so to some extent, the discussion whether we get another 0 point something increase in June or September or not is much less important than now to observe how this feeds through the system. And there are some real threats that not only banks, as we have seen, but different components of the economy and different countries will run into trouble with their ability to service their debt. That is at the moment a threat. China, I think, is a given for lower growth. The US is in the balance. And so is Europe, which has done surprise. Always when there's a crisis, Europe seems to come out better than most people expect. There's also a bit of a stereotype that Europe is always the slow one. But globally, the US, even if they get a recession, like Germany now officially is in a recession, it's not visible at all. You cannot get a server for a restaurant business or anything like that. It will be a very shallow recession with a very high level of employment and with very elevated discussions about wage increases, working from home rights and things like that. So it does not look like a classical recession at all, just because this technical decline in GDP is taking place at such a high level that really you look out of the window, you wouldn't see a problem. So that's why the problems come from the stability financial sector side at the moment, to me, not from the growth, investment, and capacity side.
And I mean, as far as the Fed goes, there's, again, because we're continuing to see this sort of relative strength in the US economy and even Europe now, you're saying there's been also talk that, well, we're going to have to continue with these interest rate rises because, we can't soften yet, contrary to what some people were saying earlier this year. But as you said, it may make no difference, that what's important is what ripples through from what's been done already. Mike, just back to OPEC again, and just the subject of sort of baselines, because that has been mentioned by a couple of members of the press and analysts in the last week leading up to this meeting, leaking that kind of word, baselines, which brings me to think, regardless of what Christoph said at the beginning, that maybe that's what they're planning to announce today, apart from, if nothing else, that, they're going to actually make some movement on this baseline debate that the UAE has been asking for higher baselines and other, do you think we could see that? Could that be a stability tool for OPEC to put out there today?
I'm not so sure. I've read the various reports, and I can see what you can see, of course. I mean, the current deal has until the end of the year to run. And therefore, there's a possibility, of course, that they can start looking at 2024 and beyond as a way of messaging that they're looking at longer-term messaging, longer-term management of things. And yes, of course, since the initial COVID measures took place, those baselines have not been revised. And as you commented at the very beginning, Christoph mentioned also in the case of Abu Dhabi, for example, certain countries are blessed with more prolific reserves under the ground, which have permitted investment in extended capacity, whereas other OPEC member states and OPEC plus countries are less blessed with fields which hold promise for the future and are managing late life developments. So, of course, you have a number of countries, and the media have focused on 3 African countries who have allegedly all been in session behind closed doors yesterday, or so I read, to discuss lowering their baselines so as to then rope them into cutting back, because those countries are reported to be producing at full capacity.
Okay, Christoph, what do you make of the sort of slightly mixed messaging that we've seen leading up to this OPEC meeting of, essentially Saudi Arabia is keeping everyone guessing, not wanting the press there, gathering in person, therefore something's going to be announced. Why would they want to do that when what everyone's looking for is more stability and less question marks? I mean, what do you think is the incentive behind that, if anything?
I think in the short term, the situation is confused enough for us to not make any guesses. This would be a mixture of criminology and tea leaf reading, the usual OPEC tea leaf reading. I think there's a fair degree of confusion. I think there was at the heart of it, a massive disappointment that the April cuts did not result in sustained higher prices or stability, to use the phrase, but came down indicating, what others have said, that fundamentals are ultimately what draws prices to them. What is more important, I think, is this kind of housekeeping in the medium term. And there it is indeed the case that capacity is increasing in some countries and others cannot produce up to quota. This is a complicated and also a political discussion, so I would not expect this to be resolved here, but I would expect that they have to address it. And you have to see the background. The background is a situation where everyone agrees that within a few years' time, we will have peak oil. And from there on, a declining or a relatively stagnant markets. That is a game changer. And OPEC must be, they will know that, in the sense that when you have a stagnant or a declining market, then it's the cheapest producer who is the king. Because in order just to maintain your own, as one exporter, your market share in a declining market, you need to compete away market share from others. Market goes down, you want to have your share constant, your volumes constant, you need to take it from others. And that requires that you have capacity and that you have cheap capacity. And where does that sit? That sits in the Middle East. And that is the background for these capacity expansions, which we're seeing now. And the second step, the quota adjustment, is merely a technical adjustment, but it will have to be tackled.
Okay, Mike, if we see another million cut announcement today, if we see it, let's assume, like economists, that we have an announcement like that, on top of the 2 plus 1.6 that's been announced already, what impact do you think tomorrow morning that will have on oil prices in the market?
All we have to go on is what happened when this happened last time. And last time, by all accounts, the market was surprised. And therefore, I think the market has entered this weekend with the mindset that they should take risk off and not basically run a balanced book. So I think open interest, as has been commented many times, is already very low and probably went even low. We don't have the data yet, of course, for the back end of last week. And therefore, the market is not particularly vested in the outcome because they've learned to expect surprises. So all I can do is turn the clock back to last time 1 million barrels a day was removed. And in fact, it turned out to be more than that after the co-opting of Saudi and then adding all the other members plus Russia. So the market jumped from, my recollection was, it jumped $6, $7, $8 per barrel. Now, obviously, that was possibly more of a surprise because now the world has learned to expect this. But really, it comes down to what really makes sense if you look at forward fundamentals. And most people who track supply demand, and many consulting shops out there, have a view on stock demand and the outlook for Q3. And the outlook heading into summer is, and we have to be very careful here because OPEC are looking at production next month. The crude oil market is already trading August, right? And in terms of supply demand terms, we should therefore be looking at Q3. But summer sees a seasonal increase, a very significant increase in the northern western hemisphere and the advanced economies. And then coming into the latter part of the year, you see a big demand surge into Asia, which could be boosted this time around by year-on-year surprise numbers because China had COVID-type consumption all the way into Q3 of last year, plus all that jet fuel that we expect to be consumed. So there is an expected stock draw in the offing for the balance of this year. And that should serve in some way to underpin, to support markets just from a supply demand point of view, because what a demand increase does is it draws inventories on the water and in inventory, and it gives people a firmer forward outlook on things. That obviously has to be counterbalanced by people's forward views on disappointing demand data. I mean, the very last piece we got, of course, was job growth in the US exceeding expectation by quite some. But people do tend to focus on high consuming and growth areas such as China, where the statistics continue to disappoint. So it's very hard to navigate the right path there. I think it's fair to say that middle of last week, the consensus in the market seemed to be that OPEC would probably not cut or didn't need to. But there have been anecdotal references to discussions since that have, I think it was Rapidan came out with a 40% likelihood of some sort of cut coming out of this weekend's meetings in Vienna, starting in about 1 hour and 12 minutes. So I don't know is the answer. But
yeah, absolutely. But you would think now with that speculation that's fed into the market, they have to do something. Otherwise, of course, you're going to have the opposite effect of what they'd want in terms of keeping that support. Christoph, let's just talk a bit about gas. Mike was talking about demand into Q3, Q4, the turnaround, uptick of that potentially coming through. Gas demand as we go into summer gas season. And then, of course, looking forward to as we get to winter later this year, what's the latest pulse on the ground in Europe on that? Is everyone still feeling quite comfortable going forward?
You mean natural gas, no, not gasoline for the.
Yeah.
So I think the situation looks a bit more relaxed, obviously, with prices, with the first discussions in Europe, whether prices might become negative again.
Yeah.
But what we are seeing is a mixture of successful adjustment of infrastructure in terms of having more regasification plants available and in the pipeline, so to speak. Then the bulkiness of the LNG trade, which tends to, dry things and then swamp them with these big deliveries. They have been swamped now. And that is because of the third point. We had indeed a mixture of a really, really, really benign winter in Europe and big savings and efficiency improvements in the use of energy generally and natural gas in particular, partially in industrial use, even replaced by oil. And that is a lasting effect. So I think what we should expect is the balance globally of gas prices being determined as it was before the crisis a little bit by China, number one. If there high demand from China, it's not by China, by Asia, sorry, but from Asia, including China, then the US extensions of production facilities will be very well utilized and prices can stabilize at a decent level. If that's not the case, for whatever reason, Asia is either because of economic crisis or because of use of other fuels, demand is weaker, then the US will not be able to export everything it has into Europe. Secondly, we should expect the outages from Russian pipeline exports to Europe to last. I think that is lost. That gas is stranded because it's produced in Western Siberia. There is no other outlet other than to Western Europe, no pipeline to China, nothing like that. And thirdly, we should not overestimate the Russian capacity to produce LNG. Some people are saying, okay, the Russians will now remain a huge gas exporter, not just to China, but also to LNG. But by all accounts, these projects are very time consuming and technically and without finance from the West, they will take even longer. So Russia will be badly hurt in terms of its gas revenues, lost 60% of its market at least for the next 7 to 10 years. And then they can compensate for it probably only with a pipeline to China. And that will draw less money than what they have with a pipeline to Europe. Okay. So on balance, I think the situation calmed down a lot, but should not underestimate the help of the weather and the volatility inherent in these LNG deliveries. I have some thing flying in here. Survey, June. Okay.
Yeah, survey.
Over
so
to you.
Something we've been discussing this morning. It's stuck. It's caught between a rock and a hard place on its output cuts decisions going forward. Probably maybe wants to lend more support to prices now again, while Russia continues to get a free pass on relatively free pass on output volumes. Agree or disagree? I think the first point that I was asking is just, could this policy continue in terms of the OPEC plus relationship? Christoph, just before I go back to Mike, just briefly, you're talking about Russia, the gas volumes and sales coming down 60%. Of course, everything that drops impacts its revenue, its war budget, if you like, its war chest. And now, again, ahead of the spring offensive that we're about to supposedly have coming up in terms of the war with Ukraine, is there any nervousness in the markets around that, Christoph, at all? Or are we just really now settled into this sort of malaise of everything is a status quo as far as the war goes?
I think there's a huge gap in the discussion, which is that by all reasonable accounts, at some point, and I would think in the next 2 years or so, the war will be over. Not in the sense that there's an official big peace accord. And I don't know how it could look like a Korean scenario with Russia being a pariah and just the shooting slowing down. It could be, God forbid, a Europe blighted by weapons of mass destruction. But the shooting will be over. It will be over in the sense that people no longer refer to it as a war. I think that's a very plausible outcome. And then what happens then? And actually, this is not discussed, even though we know a lot of reasonable assumptions of what will happen then. And I think one of the reasonable assumptions is that Russia will not disappear, nor will its commodities. So I would expect Russia to remain a large energy exporter and the system to normalize. And the implication of that would be that we see the commodity price cycle turn, and prices also coming down because of some of these trade disruptions will be turned back. So we will have low fossil fuel prices. That's the first thing. The second, which is pretty obvious, is that governments will be poorer, in particular in Europe. Maybe not China, maybe not the US, but the rest of the world being engaged in financing the war and then in the reconstruction of Ukraine will have tighter fiscal room to play with. The third thing which will happen from outside Russia is that in terms of the energy transition, there will have to be an admission that the 1.5-degree target cannot be reached. It's already in the numbers, and the boost for energy security, which Ukraine meant, will contribute to that. So there's a new mixture in the making, which will hopefully lead to some adjustments and which will probably lead to an continued emphasis on climate policy and of having renewables, but in a much more intelligent mix, a much better understanding of the energy system as a holistic system where you have fossil fuels and renewables, and where you have to look for smart ways to complement each other, to combine them, rather than thinking of it in a simple way of substituting out with the dirt and in with the clean renewables. That's never how it was going to be, and this is much less now it's going to be after this war, and it's sinking into people's consciousness. And I think to discuss, to talk about that post-war scenario, this post-shooting scenario, I should say, is a little gap in our analysis. Now, to your concrete question, I would expect either this war to die down now, because there never will be a spring offensive, because everybody sort of has behind the scenes made up their mind that 100,000 deaths for another X square kilometers of land is probably not something the Ukraine and the West wants. Or there will be the defensive, and I think that this will be pretty decisive. I think it would be relatively possible to split the eastern from the eastern from the southern frontier, and to put real squeeze on Russia, which would probably lead to political changes there. That's all speculation, but if this offensive comes, it might change things drastically. There's an equally high probability that, and already behind the scenes agreement seems to be, when you talk to people, let's let it settle, let's let it sit. It's too costly to get the land back.
I wonder how much China's involved in that. Mike, just back to you on the flows. Let's talk a bit more about, in terms of the Russia angle, Russian oil continuing to go to Asia, China, India. Give us a take on your what's demand looking like? What are the economies looking like beyond China in Asia, Southeast Asian economies? What's their response been in the last month to prices settling down a bit lower? And secondly, I want to ask you about flows, direction. Middle East crude flows, are they continuing to flow nicely into Asia? We're seeing some products go into Europe. Do you expect more changes to come in that?
God, a plethora of questions there, Diala. Okay, starting with the last one of yours. Middle Eastern flows into Asia. I do think that we're reaching a point in time, as I said earlier, a point of the year where Asian economies require more Middle Eastern oil, require more crude oil for processing, and therefore nominations will be healthier than they were in months gone by, which will be welcome news in OPEC, of course. I think the major flows that we've been looking at recently have been on LNG, as Christoph already alluded to. We have such relatively low gas prices now in Europe that the LNG complex has moved to a point where it competes with oil. And we mustn't forget that for the best part of the last 2 years, due to the Russian conflict and a couple of cold winters, we mustn't forget, which initially set things off well before that conflict, we've had LNG prices that have forced oil into the energy mix in various areas, in industries, and also in power generation. What we're seeing now is gas prices coming back to a level where those industries in Europe in particular that were diseconomic can consider switching back on again, which is good news for jobs and that sort of thing in Europe. But it has to be noted that in some cases now there might be a displacement of oil. Certainly, at one extreme point when LNG prices were many hundreds of dollars a barrel, people were finding it viable to run diesel generators, and diesel generator sales went through the roof. So I think the LNG dynamic is interesting in that Asia was priced out of the game. Asia was unable to afford LNG and resorted to burning a lot more coal to meet their power stack requirements. And that was particularly the case in South Asia, but really across Asia and also in China. So it's no surprise that coal consumption, coal imports, coal trade was buoyant. Coal is now being weighed down because LNG is actually pressing down on that side of the equation also. And then on to product flows, to the first part of your question. I don't think too much has changed since we sat down 2 months ago with you, Diala, and also a month ago with Sean. But I think it's fair to say that the price cap has, in a very broad sense, met the objective of keeping the oil that the world definitely needs flowing to market. and perhaps more efficiently so than some might have suspected. Whilst restricting flow of dollars to Russia, as was the intent also of the price cap. There had been some talk about revisions to the price cap. Clearly, it is impossible to make use of international shipping, G7 banks, G7 insurance companies to ship those products that are currently trading above the price cap, because the price cap is arguably too low. And I'm referring to the heavy products at $45 a barrel. But given the compression in diesel cracks and the lower flat price of crude oil, the $100 price cap for diesel does make it possible for some of that diesel, one assumes, to move. And I think it's been observed in previous calls that the floating inventory of oil from Russia with a question mark over where it's going has worked its way off into the market. So again, I think you posed me a leading question at the outset: is it moving to Asia? The answer is yes, of course, that's where it has to go. On crude, it's very simple. It's China and Russia and not much else. And on product, it is finding its way to multiple markets that can find that pathway around the price cap legislation.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Mike Muller, head of Vitol Asia, and Christoph Ruhl, from senior research scholar at the Columbia University. Thank you so much for joining us. There's our answer, quite clear, 83%. They are caught between a rock and a hard place, OPEC. They're in a bit of a dilemma, but let's see if that manifests later in the agreement or announcement that comes out supposedly later today from Vienna. Do they provide more clarity to the market or not? They'll stop the market guessing, at least at that point. So 83% think that they are a bit stuck now in terms of how they move forward, especially managing their partnership with Russia. Thank you so much to Christoph and Mike, and have a great week ahead, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.